I think between now and maybe the summer, maybe the autumn, this is Russia's last chance to break Ukraine. And they're going to throw everything at this. I mean, they're going to, missiles, drones, running units in to try to overrun, infiltrate towns in the south and in the east. And if Russia's going to, out of a position of weakness, try to project strength in these next few months, Europe has to respond.
Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, Sofia. It's so good to see both of you today.
Likewise, thank you. US President Donald Trump met today with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Davos. Trump described the meeting, which lasted about an hour, as good. The talks come as Trump's foreign policy envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are going to meet today with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin in Moscow. So after this another Trump-Zelensky meeting, where do negotiations stand right now, and does this meeting change anything?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's what we know and what we don't know as I speak to you here on a Thursday afternoon. As we are speaking, President Zelensky is speaking to journalists, so there may be updates even while we are on air. What we know is that both he and Donald Trump have called this a good or a very good meeting from the standpoint of public relations. That's an achievement. We know how temperamental Donald Trump has been. We know how past meetings have gone with President Zelensky. So we know that this is not like last February in the White House with the ambush by the Vice President J.D. Vance. On the other hand, we don't know if this is as good a meeting as we had last April, when in the Vatican, Zelensky was able to get Trump face-to-face in the Basilica, and that pulled Trump back from that support of the Kremlin, where the U.S. had cut off intelligence, where the U.S. had cut off military assistance. What we especially do not know is whether they discussed the details of the Ukraine-Europe proposals to end the Russian invasion. Now that's important because we've actually got two different, as it were, proposals that are still circulating here. The Ukraine-Europe proposals, just a quick reminder, they pushed back an ultimatum that Trump's own envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who, as you mentioned, are in Moscow today, had developed with Vladimir Putin's top advisor, Kirill Dmitriev. That was in late October. The Ukraine-Europe proposal succeeded in pushing back Russia getting any more territory, especially all of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. It pushed back Russia trying to prevent security guarantees for Ukraine. So now we have security guarantees for Ukraine, which include U.S. participation through the leadership of aerial operations. It pushed back the Russian demand for split control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and it pushed back the idea that the recovery fund for Ukraine would be first for American profits rather than for Ukraine's recovery. Those four issues. The problem here is we don't know where we are in terms of getting the Trump camp on their final approval of that proposals. And that's complicated because of Witkoff and Kushner in Moscow. Are they going there to tell Vladimir Putin, look, these are the Ukraine-Europe proposals. These are what you need to accept, which includes a ceasefire on the current front lines. Or are they going there where Putin will say, no, here's what we had agreed with you last October. Here's this ultimatum. Why don't we get back to that? The problem is not only that Donald Trump is unpredictable, he's chaotic at the best of times. The problem is not only that he may be temperamental this week because he's had to retreat over the attempt to seize Greenland. The problem is that Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate developer, has been manipulated by the Kremlin ever since the start of 2025. Remember, they did a psychological profile on him so that they wanted to deal with him and not with Keith Kellogg. who was supposed to be the envoy for Russia. We also know that Jared Kushner tends to operate not on the basis of diplomacy, security, geopolitics. He operates on the basis of economics. Who can get money out of the deal? So let me give you one thing that we think is happening in that Kremlin meeting. Donald Trump, unwisely, but unsurprisingly, has offered Vladimir Putin a position on the Board of Peace for Gaza. Now, this actually has very little relevance to what people in Gaza are going through. It's a Trump ego project where he gets to be chairman of the board. At Davos today, there were 19 countries that said, yeah, we'll sign on to this to flatter Trump. Only 2 of them, by the way, were from Europe, Viktor Orban's Hungary and Bulgaria. Putin reportedly is going to tell Kushner and Witkoff, in exchange for getting on the Board of Peace, I'm going to give Gaza $1 billion, but that's going to come from frozen Russian assets in the United States. So Putin's not actually putting any of his money into this. Those assets are already frozen. But he's going to use that to try to flatter Witkoff and Kushner. And then once he says, oh, okay, here's that $1 billion, then he might say, let's talk about Ukraine now. And let's get back to the root causes of the conflict, which is Kremlin speak for, give us what we want.
Let's cover also another interesting statement about the state of negotiations, because both President Trump and Steve Witkoff are really confident that they can make a deal over Ukraine war. President Trump said, quote, that the deal was now reasonably close to this success. And US envoy Steve Witkoff said Thursday that a lot of progress has been made in the Ukraine negotiations. According to Witkoff, it's a matter that can be resolved if both sides are willing. And according to Witkoff, negotiations are just down to just one remaining issue. So just one issue to be solved, and we have a deal, according to Steve Witkoff. Mm-hmm. What is your take on that? Is he right? Is Trump right? Is Witkoff right? Or are these just illusions and hopes?
Hey, Mr. Witkoff, tell us what that one issue is. You know, don't just tease us. We're talking security guarantees? Are we talking Donetsk? Are we talking Zaporizhia nuclear plant?
Probably territory.
What's that one issue? Yeah, or territory. You know, look. If I had $1 for every time that Donald Trump, Stephen Witkoff said we are close to a deal, I'd be a really rich man, and I wouldn't be talking to you because I'd have a Caribbean island I'd be enjoying the sunshine in, with respect. And Donald Trump came into office saying, 24 hours, we'll have a deal within 24 hours. Then it was like, oh, we'll have a deal in the spring, in the summer, in the autumn. So push all of that aside. We will have a deal soon, and get to the practical realities of what we are talking about here. If the Ukraine-Europe proposals are put to Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin will reject them. They will reject them because they want all of Donetsk. They have made this clear. They do not want to freeze on the current lines of contact in the east or in the south. Secondly, they do not want Ukraine to have any significant security guarantees. They have said that they will, in fact, threaten to attack European peacekeepers or European forces if they're in Ukraine to help with the security guarantees. They have rejected any type of arrangement in which all of the Russian frozen assets are used for Ukrainian recovery. And they have continually said, including this week, that they want the removal of the Zelensky government. Mr. Medvedev said that either a couple days or maybe even a couple days ago, I think, or even maybe yesterday. So the Ukraine-Europe proposals are not acceptable to Russia. Now, if Witkoff and Kushner come back from Russia saying, you know, we should get back to this ultimatum, and Russia should have all of the Donetsk region, and there should not be any security guarantees, that will not be acceptable not only to Kyiv, it will not be acceptable to Kyiv's European partners, their European allies. You know, eyes are open here, and I think you all already know this. that the only way we get to a resolution of this is probably in two ways. One is that Ukraine is finally forced to effectively surrender, and that is the Russian tactic right now. The Russian tactic is to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure so that Ukrainians who have resisted, they've resisted since 2014, but especially resisted the full-scale invasion for almost 4 years, the Ukrainians finally put pressure on the government to say, we just can't take this anymore because you all are freezing, because you all are in the dark. I've got news for the Kremlin. And I'm talking to a couple of Ukrainian folks here who are having to endure the power cuts. And you know a lot of people who are enduring the power cuts, and Ukrainians are not giving up. So let's put that one to the side. The second way this ends is that if Vladimir Putin can no longer carry out the military invasion to the extent that he is right now, not only with the escalated air attacks, but continuing to try to get some type of breakthrough on the front lines, and if he cannot continue to finance the invasion at the current rate that it's persisting, and if he is damaged by Ukrainian counterattacks, he might just have to give up, or he might be put in a position where he has to give up. But I don't think that's happening in the near future. So I think this is why I'm reacting strongly. It's why I'm reacting strongly to all this idea of peace around the corner, peace around the corner. What Ukrainians deserve is the truth. Ukrainians do not deserve false promises. They don't deserve false promises from their government or from the US government or anyone else. So that sense of realism, which is what the Ukrainian government comes back to. What do we need here? We don't need false promises. We need air defenses because these attacks will probably continue for the foreseeable future. We need equipment and weapons so that we can put pressure on the Russians. We need toughening of sanctions and the use of Russians' frozen assets to bolster us because that swings the economic balance in our favor in the war. That's what we should be talking about beyond the Ukraine and Europe proposals when they are probably rejected by the Kremlin.
Indeed, now we are on the air and we have some news from Volodymyr Zelensky. He said, I quote, that he had a good meeting with Donald Trump. They discussed many topics and that some documents are already ready, and they also discussed about air defense system, as you mentioned, that indeed in Kyiv we feel that strikes will continue. We have these strikes almost every week. We sit in the capital of Ukraine without heat, water or electricity for a couple of days, and actually, that's interesting. I would like to ask you, how do you assess the possibility that Americans will send to Ukraine at least some air defense systems from their side, not just through this maybe Pearl program, but just as an additional aid?
I think any American air defense systems are going to come through the Pearl program, which is the program by which they sell them to NATO countries who then transfer them to Ukraine. And that's just simply because Trump, he operates as someone who has to make a profit out of this. I mean, that's been one of the problems throughout the administration. So he can say, oh, America's making money by selling these things. The question here is, will America sell those systems? How many of those systems will they sell? And that we just honestly don't know. I mean, we don't honestly know in terms of how many systems the Americans have available. And also, we just have this problem. And that I think people in the Pentagon realize we need to keep supporting Ukraine. I think people in other U.S. agencies know we need to keep supporting Ukraine. But then you get someone like the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who has no interest in Ukrainian security and who actually, of course, cut off all aid to Ukraine a year ago. So I can't tell you that. I think what I'm interested in a wider sense is, look, what if the American systems don't come in the near future, right? And that comes as, where are the other air defenses going to come from? Now, in part, I think what I found interesting, and you could probably inform me more on this, is this series of announcements from the Zelensky government this week about a new approach to air defenses, including to counter the drones and the missiles. You're talking about domestically made Ukrainian drones that are being talked about. You're talking also about better coordination between military units. This is all coming, of course, because you have a new defense minister, Mr. Fedorov. Then you need to say, all right, well, where does that Ukraine, that overhaul of air defenses or those changes, how do they coordinate that with European allies? So they coordinate it with European allies in terms of what type of equipment can Europe provide that is provided, that's on the place there. So you really have, and it's been the story of this conflict, that this is not like a war where everything started in 2022 and it's like, oh, this is the equipment and the weapons that we have in 2026. The technology has moved so quickly here. The Russians are always trying to get more effective missiles and drones to hit you, and then Ukraine's trying to get more effective drone defenses and air defenses. And I have to say, with respect, I understand why you want the American air defense systems. But given the unpredictability of the Trump administration, I think that focus on Ukraine, Europe, and other international partners is at least equally important in terms, at least for the near future.
Let's also cover this big discussion and topic of Greenland. Probably no one expected this, but US President Donald Trump retreated from on Wednesday from threats to use tariffs to pressure Denmark over Greenland, and he said this after the meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. What is your assessment of this offer from Rutte to President Trump? What did he offer him, and what did play the most, significant role in convincing him to push back, to step away from, to retreat from these threats?
No. Let me start with an immediate answer to your question, but then I need to walk this back and go step by step what happened here. Donald Trump did not retreat, bail out from trying to seize Greenland because NATO offered him a deal which would provide U.S. sovereignty over their bases in Greenland. He made that up to cover his retreat, okay? And the reason why I know that, I suspected it, because Donald Trump doesn't always tell the truth. The reason why I know that is that last night, after American officials went and leaked that, NATO put out an official statement which did not mention any discussion of giving U.S. sovereignty over those bases. More importantly, Danish officials and Greenlander officials said there is no discussion of sovereignty that we will accept. We will not give up sovereignty. Remember, the U.S. has autonomy over those bases. They have jurisdiction over those bases. They can expand those bases. They can add more bases, but they still have to be in Danish and Greenlander sovereign territory. Today, what NATO has said in general terms is that what Mark Rutte and Donald Trump actually discussed was bolstering security arrangements for Greenland, which is something that NATO has been discussing for years, including with Denmark, and which they're quite happy to say to the U.S., if you want to contribute more to Greenland security working with us, that would be great. So why did Trump bail out? A couple of days ago, I was watching the statements at Davos, and I noticed the Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and his interviews with Fox TV, the American outlet, and then his general presentation to Davos. And of course, publicly, Bessent saying, oh, Donald Trump, he's great. He's really interested in pushing back the Russian and Chinese threat. NATO need to accept what the U.S. is saying. But Bessent also said everyone needs to stop overreacting. They need to take a step back. And he looked a little bit concerned at that point. And then there was a later incident in which the most important group maybe this week that you won't hear about is the Danish Teachers Pension Fund, because they pulled out all of their money that they have in U.S. assets, including U.S. bonds. That's about $100 million. Now, the U.S. has trillions of dollars in bonds and in other assets that people invest in. But when Bessent was asked about that, he just simply said, oh, they're irrelevant. And when he said that, I thought, yeah, no, They're actually quite relevant. Here's the short answer. Donald Trump retreated for a number of reasons. He retreated in part because Europe showed a unified line at Davos. Far from caving in and abandoning Denmark and giving in to Trump's bullying, they said Danish and Greenlander sovereignty is paramount. It is number one. Secondly, the European Union in early February, just after Trump was going to put on these additional tariffs, these 10% tariffs on 8 European countries, the European Union had a decision to make about their waiver on tariffs against the United States from last summer. Because when the United States imposed 15% tariffs, the Europeans did not respond. They put in a waiver. So the Europeans in early February could introduce their 15% tariff on 93 billion euros of American goods. So they had an instrument to use here. Back in the United States, 85% of Americans do not support seizing Greenland. 95% do not support using military force. Republicans in Congress, some of them who are now speaking openly, do not support this. But the big issue here, the big issue, is that if Trump had persisted with this, if he had tried to seize Greenland, there was a threat to the U.S. stock market, which has been dropping over the last few days, and there is a threat to the bond market, that people would pull their money out of American bonds. Last April, when Donald Trump tried to bully the world with his tariffs, the so-called Liberation Day, and when we were talking about 30, 40, 50% tariffs, after a week, the U.S. stock market was dropping, and there was major withdrawals from U.S. bonds. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the man I talked about a moment ago, he and the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick went to Trump and said, we can't sustain this. We can't prevent the damage on the stock and bond markets if you persist. I cannot prove this, but I suspect Scott Bessent and other officials went to Trump yesterday, on the Wednesday, and said to Trump, you cannot sustain this. Not a question of military invasion. It's not that you're not going to do that. You cannot sustain this tariff threat because it will damage us economically. And he chickened out. He retreated. He made up the story that NATO had offered him a deal. And now he has to try to save face. I think we'll end up in a place where, with very carefully language that doesn't try to embarrass Trump too much, there will be a U.S. statement with NATO about committing to further discussions about Greenland security.
And another short question for you about Mark Rutte. How can you assess the role of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in mediating this battle between another war between US and Europeans? Because recently Alexander Stubb, Finnish president, said that Mark Rutte would be the person who would, be in charge of managing this problem.
Yeah, well, Mark Rutte says nice things about Trump, right? Remember the idea, let's everybody call Trump daddy, one of the worst statements ever made. It's like, okay, that's the last thing I want to call Donald Trump is my daddy. And Rutte, you'll notice that in his public statements, he never comes out and criticizes Trump. He never comes out and calls out Trump's chaotic actions. He never says that Trump is declining mentally, which Trump is. He flatters Trump. It's that whole question of stroking Trump's ego. But there was a purpose here. I mean, a lot of people have criticized Rutte for this, and I understand. But there was a purpose here for this. And that is, you were going to get the stick from European leaders this week. They had finally decided they had had enough because there is no alliance with the Trump camp. The Trump camp don't believe in alliance. So Europe finally had to call this out. And you had a series of European leaders at the start of the week in Davos. Emmanuel Macron, who without referring to Trump, talked about neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism. You had the Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, who quoted an Italian philosopher named Antonio Gramsci. But it's a great quote. It says, between the dying of the old and the coming of the new, there are monsters. And you know which monsters he was talking about. Ursula von der Leyen talked about the EU basically could not rely on the US, had to investment, capital, manufacturing, AI, technology, had to develop quickly. working together. And then you had the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, probably the speech of the conference, speech of the year possibly, which said, look, the international order as we know it's gone. U.S. leadership, he called it hegemony. U.S. leadership used to give us, security. It used to give us progress. It doesn't do that anymore. And then he said, if you are not on the table, you are on the menu. If you stand by and let Trump do this, he will take advantage of you. So they were the stick. This was this statement that the EU was not going to accept his demands. So Rutte comes in and he plays the nice guy and says, okay, let's talk. Let's talk. You've got concerns about Greenland security. You've got your base there. Look, we can do something about this. You can expand your base. You can put in more bases. You can be the guy who is like chairman of the board for Greenland security, whatever, right? But it's a question of what the fundamental here is that the Trump people went to Davos trashing NATO, telling NATO, accept that we are NATO, that the U.S. gets to set the terms. And by yesterday, we were at the U.S. is going to consult with NATO, which is exactly what this should have been. There should never have been a threat to seize Greenland, which was for other motives. The reason why the Trump folks wanted to seize Greenland had nothing to do with security. It had to do with getting rare earth minerals. It had to do with Trump's ego, and it had to do with showing American dominance. European leaders called the bluff. Mark Rutte sweet-talked Trump. And I think we're in a much better place than we were 72 hours ago because of that.
I just want to follow up on the upcoming meeting in Moscow, and of course, yesterday Putin noted that there are three main topics on the agenda. It's of course the Russian war against Ukraine. Trump's proposed this Council of Peace, Board of Peace, and of course the fate of frozen Russian assets. Putin is said to be pushing what aides describe as a clever scheme, actually tapping roughly $5 billion in Russian frozen assets held in the U.S., not only, to send this money to this peace council, but also, as you said earlier in our interview, to use this money to rebuild Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories. And this idea, for me, sounds very cynical. And from your perspective, how American officials likely to react to this proposal?
Okay, here's the tough part. I don't know. Because Steve Witkoff is unpredictable. Because he likes to be friends with the Russians. The Russians have exploited that. So I don't know if Steve Witkoff will go in with the Ukraine-Europe proposal, which is what he should do. Jared Kushner thinks just in terms of money. So the Putin people come back with him on terms of money. Jared Kushner is also on the Board of Peace for Gaza, as is Witkoff. So you flatter them by saying, okay, we'll use those Russian frozen assets in the United States, and you can have that for your Gaza development. So you've played to Kushner's ego and his business motives. You've played to Witkoff's wish to be buddies. And then you play back to Donald Trump thinking, oh, I've got something shiny for my Board of Peace, which actually means very little for Gazans. I mean, absolutely less than nothing. And I can explain that to you in a separate podcast about how we have a fragile ceasefire and very little else for Gaza at this point. I think if we were to think about it, there's a fundamental here in terms of what Putin is doing, which is, look, he says to the Americans, look, you can have some of my frozen assets and use it for what you want. What he then does is say, I've got 300 billion euros in frozen assets, $300 billion, I should say, in frozen assets. About 2/3 of that is in Europe, right? So you got more than 200 billion euros in Europe. And we know that Europe almost, Belgium blocked it, but we know that Europe almost devoted those frozen assets to the reparations loan. So Putin says to the Americans, look, you see what you can do with my assets that are in the United States? You can have even more of my assets that are frozen in Europe, and you can use them for, well, let's rebuild Ukraine territories in Ukraine, except he doesn't say which territories in Ukraine they are. the money doesn't necessarily go to Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian controlled territory, it goes to Russian occupied territory. Because the Russians don't have the money right now to rebuild the occupied areas of Ukraine. They made a big deal. I'm going to tell you what upset me, and I know it upset you as well. I'm going to say it because I want people out here that are watching this to know this. They spent the money on a couple of showpiece projects, like the Mariupol theater, where they killed probably hundreds of people, maybe more than 600 people. Look, we have a shiny theater. Yeah, right. Okay, there's blood all over that. But that's the type of thing they'll show the Americans and say, oh, look, you can rebuild this, you can rebuild that. So they're going to try to get the Americans to bail them out on their own occupied territory while preventing the money from being used for Ukraine. I think, I can't guarantee it, but that would be my analysis of where this will go. Now, once again, your question, how do the Americans respond? Because if they respond by saying, yes, that's a wonderful idea, they've just pushed away the Ukraine-Europe proposals that have been developed for months.
Let's also cover another breaking news. We just are hearing recent remarks by President Zelensky in Davos. He's being unusually critical of his European allies, according to Bloomberg, telling them they need to wake up and learn how to defend themselves. So Zelensky is almost mocking Europeans and asks what the point was of sending small contingent of military personnel to Greenland. He says only 40 soldiers. He also suggested that Ukraine could help NATO and Europeans to defend Greenland. Also, President Zelensky slammed European allies for what he said was their indecision and reluctance to make tough decisions. He also said that Europeans advised him not to move forward with this topic of Tomahawk missiles, not to ask Trump to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, just to not make him being angry at Europeans, at Ukrainians, and moreover, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced a trilateral meeting with Americans, Russians, Ukrainians in the upcoming days to discuss the peace talks, to do these negotiations. What is your reaction to such tough messages Zelensky is sending right now to Europeans?
Yeah, let's take the last one first, because it's not going to happen. I mean, it makes sense for Zelensky to say, let's have a meeting. Ukraine, Russia, US, and Europe. Makes absolute sense. Kremlin won't accept it. Kick that one to the side. Let's get to your question of, okay, what was the message he was sending with the way he talked about the Europeans? It works at multiple levels. One, he's not going to criticize Trump publicly. Not going to do it. That doesn't get anywhere, right? So two, the focus on Europe is in part, don't get distracted here. Just because you have had a serious crisis over Greenland, and it was serious, don't lose sight of Ukraine. We're still here. And this is the one where there's an actual invasion which has happened, not one that's been threatened. Three, and I think this is the most interesting part, we've seen Europe act pretty tough over Greenland, and we've seen them act pretty quickly over Greenland, right? So Zelensky's looking at that, and he's sort of saying to the Europeans, look, you acted quickly and you acted decisively over Greenland. Do the same here. Stop hesitating about trying to basically give Putin an off-ramp to end this invasion. Stop getting down in bureaucracy. Stop getting worried about objections from Viktor Orban and from someone else. Push on this. And that means air defenses, as we discussed earlier. That means other equipment and other weapons, and it means the financial support. There was a big setback, I think, from Zelensky's point of view in December. I mean, I can present this to you as a half-full thing, which is that in the end, the European Union came up with the 90 billion euro loan arrangement to go into 2027. But what the Zelensky government was hoping for was the use of those frozen Russian assets, which would have been far more money that could have taken them even further through the end of 2027, and they didn't get it because of the Belgian objections. And what he's saying to Europe is, you can't wait around on this. And I do think that he also knows he's got a bit more force amongst his statements because of the Russian attempt to break the energy infrastructure. European leaders can see that this is a critical moment. I think we are probably at everything seems critical. I mean, everything's critical when you're being invaded by the Russians. I think we're at an important moment in the course of this full-scale invasion. And that is, I think between now and maybe the summer, maybe the autumn, this is Russia's last chance to break Ukraine. And they're going to throw everything at this. I mean, they're going to, missiles, drones, running units in to try to overrun, infiltrate towns in the south and in the east. And if Russia's going to, out of a position of weakness, try to project strength in these next few months, Europe has to respond. Europe has to man up to this. And there's always a problem with the EU. It's 27 countries. It's 27 countries. It's a further problem when at least two of those countries, Hungary and Slovakia, actually are more allied with the Kremlin than they are with Ukraine. Well, look, the other 25, stop messing about. It's difficult to get you all to agree, but do it, right? So I think that's the starting point I'd work with Zelensky's message. Now what we watch for is European reaction. What does Merz's Germany say? What does Macron's France say? What does Meloni's Italy say? We know what the Baltics will say. We know what Poland will probably say. They will be all on board on this. But those other European members, UK as well, are you going to answer the call, right? And what does Ursula von der Leyen say? She gave a very good speech at the start of this week about Europe having to get its act together economically and financially because of the American threat. Now, what does she say about the fundamental issue about Ukrainian security? From an economic and financial point of view, but it intersects with the military resistance as well.
And most final question, I would really appreciate a short answer because we don't have a lot of time. Why does Vladimir Putin, why does he say Greenland is not our concern, right? Why does he hesitate to, use this as a reason to criticize the West?
Well, because what he's saying is, it's your problem. You can deal with it. Why should Putin take a stance here, right? If he comes out and says Greenland's sovereignty is what matters, he's going to upset Trump, right? If he comes out and says it's absolutely fine for Trump to seize Greenland, then he looks like a bit of a bad guy in terms of international standards, even though I know he breaks them all the time. So what's the easy answer here? Look, this issue's threatening to rip the US and Europe apart. Let it do so. Sometimes the best thing to do in terms of causing trouble and chaos is just to stand back. Problem for Putin is Europe was a lot tougher on Greenland than Trump expected and than Putin expected. So let's go back to Sofia's question. Will Europe be tougher than Putin and Trump expect in the next few days, the next few weeks about Ukraine?
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for your another in-depth discussion, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you both very much. Stay safe.